We know that true crime about serial murder is dark and disturbing, so why do we love to watch? And are there real-life consequences for this genre's explosion? Welcome to WatchMojo's series, The Evolution of True Crime. For this episode, we're looking at how true crime media turned serial killers into celebrities. To say a serial killer is a celebrity is not to say he's an admirable character. It's to say the way we talk about them, think about them, and represent them in media is comparable to how we talk, think, and represent other famous figures in pop culture. But how does this impact our understanding of crime and justice? In an era so saturated by media, does the line between actual crime and true crime start to blur?
Every news organization across the country was now interested in Ted Bundy.
Serial killing has pretty much existed everywhere and always, but the English term was coined in the 1970s. While there is some debate about who exactly named it, what's important for us here is what it describes.
Monster, right? But what do you really know about him?
A serial killer is generally understood to be a murderer with 3 or more victims, with a time gap between so-called killing events. This is what separates them from spree and mass killers. Spree killers operate in a short time frame, and mass murderers are more interested in scale. Pop culture interest in serial killers is generally thought to have started with Jack the Ripper in the 1890s. These killings in the Whitechapel neighborhood of London generated tons of pulp media, rumors, stories, and general cultural hullabaloo. But the fact that the term serial killer entered the law enforcement lexicon in the 1970s is not random. This marks the beginning of what has come to be known as the golden age of serial killing in the United States, 1970 to 1999.
It's happened in New York. The son of Sam killer terrorized the city for months. With a .44 caliber revolver, he shot couples in parked cars.
Famously, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, the Golden State Killer, David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, Jeffrey Dahmer, BTK, Richard Ramirez, the Zodiac Killer, and others were all active during this period. Investigative historian Peter Vronsky claims that over 80% of American serial killers were active during this golden age. Why? There is no one definitive answer, but this era generated a huge proportion of the true crime stories we consume today. So let's start with this. What makes a serial killer?
You have to kill Eileen Warnes because she'll kill again.
Quick facts. 92% of serial killers are male. Most commit their first murder between the ages of 25 and 34. Serial killers rarely target victims outside of their ethnic group, but often target the opposite sex. Psychopathy and sociopathy are real conditions, but those living with them do not necessarily become serial killers. And not all serial killers are necessarily psycho or sociopaths.
Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder, something which gives you a greater sense of excitement.
But experts say that people who could be predisposed to violent impulses, like psychopaths are, can be socialized into acting upon them. For example, if a kid with psychopathy is exposed to physical abuse at a young age, they may be more likely to reproduce this behavior themselves.
And what do you do to the animals, Beth?
Stick them with pants.
And since empathy might not come naturally to them, they may struggle to identify this behavior as wrong. Children who experience severe trauma can also develop patterns of emotional suppression that can lead them to victimize people later in life, struggling to feel empathy or remorse.
As I'm sitting there with a severed head in my hand, talking to it, and I said, well, wait a minute. I see old paintings and drawings of Viking heroes talking to severed heads and taking them to parties, old enemies in leather bags. Part of our heritage.
If we go back to this ironic term, this golden age, let's look at the timing. Men aged 25 to 34 in the 1970s were born in the 1940s and 50s. World War II and the Korean War destabilized many young families across the United States during these decades, as many people returned from war with immense trauma. Many men did not return at all, leaving behind young families with their own trauma, higher rates of poverty, and so forth. Experts have pointed to this wave of destabilized homes as one factor potentially leading to the rise of serial killing in the generation that followed, because these children were more frequently neglected or exposed to violence and abuse. Experts have also pointed to the Great Depression as having a similar effect. There are, of course, many, many different experiences of war and returning home. But for instance, Dennis Rader, aka BTK, Richard Cottingham, the Torso Killer, and Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, all had war veteran fathers in deeply unstable family homes.
When he drank, he was almost like a different person. My dad struck all of his children all the time.
It's a gross oversimplification to say that one thing directly leads to the other. But given the high rates of abuse and childhood exposure to violence reported by convicted serial killers of this era, a connection begins to emerge. Violence and trauma can cycle across generations.
When Richard's father would get mad, he would get the hammer and hit his own head.
He got mad at Richard. He beat the hell out of him. He would get my dolls, I remember, and he would always act like he was going to poke out their eyes.
Other factors that experts point to when examining the Golden Age are the massive cultural shifts of the 1960s and 70s. Rising youth and countercultures led to more transience among young people, more runaways, more recreational drug use, more hitchhiking, more women traveling alone. In other words, the pool of potential victims simply grew. There were suddenly a lot of young people wandering the world alone, linking up with strangers, going on adventures, not necessarily wanting to be found. Draft dodging during the Vietnam War is also a factor here, as a lot of young people were traveling under fake names, using fake backstories. This made it harder to identify them once they were found, or to have them labeled missing in the first place. The construction of the interstate highway in the 1950s is also a factor. Increased mobility, hitchhiking, isolated roads, lack of surveillance. All of these social and cultural factors made this generation more likely to kill, and more easily killed.
I just stabbed to death and cut the throat of an innocent young woman. She was 19 years old, and her roommate in the trunk who died right after that was 18.
This era is the basis of the true crime frenzy we're living in now. Because while serial killing itself has sharply declined in the 21st century, we are still producing and consuming media about this era of killers. Mindhunter, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, The Good Nurse, and Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, are all examples of this fascinating nostalgia. As these stories keep coming back into circulation with younger actors, cooler aesthetics, and more violence, these real-life figures become further immortalized in pop culture memory.
That's so hot.
But the relationship between serial killing and celebrity culture doesn't just live in legacy. Serial killers, like the rest of us, are conscious of pop culture, Hollywood, politics, history, and so forth. These are the cultural factors that shape our social world, and celebrity culture is a part of that.
Was that Rick Dalton?
Who?
The guy from Bounty Law.
Who, Jake Cahill?
Yeah, that guy in the road was Jake Cahill. Rick Dalton played Jake Cahill in a cowboy show in the 50s called Bounty Law.
The showboating, performative Bundy trials where he represented himself and got married in court.
Carol, do you want to marry me? I want to marry you.
The Tate LaBianca murders being deemed the end of the 60s.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski.
These are pop culture moments as much as they are major criminal cases. And even during this golden age, serial killers themselves were aware of their notoriety, their overlap into celebrity culture.
Contrary to Section 78204 Florida statute, I'll plead not guilty right now, and you're...
During his peak as a celebrity murderer, Richard Ramirez signed his artworks Richard Ramirez, Night Stalker, reinforcing his public persona, his brand.
Do you think it's a little strange that these women are coming to see you?
No, because the majority is not necessarily correct.
Dennis Rader suggested his own title, an acronym for Bind, Torture, Kill, in his infamous letters to police. As Dahmer's murder pad was discovered by police in 1991, media rights were allegedly being sold within the hour. Exceptional acts and personas, public panic, and explosive media coverage converged to make killers into celebrities.
Why were you in the courtroom today?
I just wanted to see what he looked like. I think he's cute.
In the early 1990s, several factors came together to bring serial killing to the center stage of media. First, as we've already seen, the actual real-life problem of serial killing during this era. Second, the increasingly sensationalized coverage of these crimes, with identifiable figures and personas attached to them. The third is actually the release of The Silence of the Lambs, the book in 1988, then the movie in 91.
The 25-year-old daughter of Senator Ruth Martin, listed first as a missing person, is now believed to have been kidnapped by the serial killer known only as Buffalo Bill.
Thomas Harris's characters and Anthony Hopkins' portrayal were largely responsible for a resurgence of pop culture interest in serial killing in the 90s, coinciding with the crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer and Eileen Wuornos, two super publicized cases. This is when the golden age of serial killing starts to transition into a golden age of serial killer media. It creates a loop. Serial killing is happening, the media reports on it, serial killing becomes the thing everyone is talking about, the media capitalizes on the social trend by releasing increasingly bold, sensational stories, which in turn increases the social stock and marketability of real-life crimes and criminals.
Taking my life like this and getting rich off it all these years. It was used for books and movies and shit. Ladder climbs, re-election, everything else. I'm not giving you book and movie info.
Reality and storytelling blend together in nonfiction media, amplifying the persona of the killer in the public imagination. What separates a serial killer movie from a slasher flick is who the audience is meant to identify with, the killer or the victim. Slasher movies are all about the terror of the victims and how we imagine ourselves in the scenarios we see on screen. Don't go into the basement, why doesn't she call the police, etc., etc.
I'm calling the police!
A serial killer movie is different. It is about the persona and the mind of the killer. This is who we identify with. Hannibal Lecter is a perfect example. Hannibal the Cannibal is not some guy in a hockey mask stumbling around with a machete. He is cunning, calculating, a master manipulator, a genius in his fields, both psychiatry and psycho-killing.
First principles, Clarice. Simplicity. Read Marcus Aurelius. Of each particular thing, ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature?
Crime media often paints these killers as exceptional, almost superhuman. Terrifying, no doubt, but also impressive, set apart from regular criminals. Hannibal, for example, is certainly a monster, but he's also a genius who outwits those who try to contain him.
Jimmy, watch it, he's got it!
He is the opposite of so-called degenerate serial killers like Buffalo Bill, who is cast as incoherent, queer-coded, living in squalor, incompetent.
What the lotion in the basket?
A similar dichotomy can be seen in nonfiction coverage of crimes during the 80s and 90s. Murderer celebrities are often guys next door, middle class or affluent, active in their communities.
Jeffrey Dahmer is intelligent and articulate. That is what makes him so frightening.
The angle of their story focuses on their cunning, their ability to disguise their true form and walk among us, be part of our communities. Dennis Rader, for instance.
Rader was out there in the community hiding in plain sight.
In my mind, there was two people in that body. One of them was a husband and father, the Boy Scout leader. The other one was an absolute animal.
On the other side of this dichotomy, during the same era, we see a massive wave of reality and nonfiction media about the police cracking down on lower-level crimes. Cops, for example, was shot overwhelmingly in low-income neighborhoods, showcasing arrests of mostly people of color and immigrants.
Where did you just come from? From the projects?
Yes. You wanna go home, Papi?
Are you calling me Papi again?
By officer, Mr. Damiano.
Celebrity criminals are often given an aura of exceptionality and genius, while the common criminal is anonymous, a symbol of moral weakness in opposition to the officers who arrest them. There are some serial killer celebrities like Eileen Wuornos or Ed Kemper who do not fit into the walks among us mold, but they are exceptional. Wuornos because female serial killers are rare, and Kemper because of the particular savagery of his crimes. But media coverage of their stories still reinforces the pattern. There is an angle to their stories that allows them to transcend common criminal tropes.
I am an American, and I killed Americans. I am a human being, and I killed human beings. And I did it in my society.
They're not mastermind geniuses. They are chaotic, tragic figures.
My mother, Diane, let me tell you something. She plopped me out of her belly, left me with my grandparents, and we never knew her. I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass.
But this is also a trope that allows serial killers to enter into pop culture history.
If a woman humiliates her little boy, he will become hostile and violent and debased. Period.
In the 2000s and 2010s, we see characters like Dexter appear, a cool and sympathetic serial killer who audiences welcome as their protagonist. Having become accustomed to the shocking and sensational tone of serial killer stories, we come to accept them as a part of pop culture. Shows like Mindhunter and Dahmer push this even further, featuring real-life serial killers as written characters with snappy dialogue and engaging personas.
Charles Manson, the most dangerous man alive. Hippie cult leader who programmed people to kill. In that book, he's got me so powerful, it looked for me stopped his watch.
On screen, they are no longer real people who committed real crimes, but personas and concepts that become vehicles for the filmmaker's story, icons. Another essential piece of the celebrity system is this: profit. And not just how media companies generate profit from covering tragic and traumatic events, but the concept of murderabilia. Murderabilia is an umbrella term for collectible items connected to violent crimes and their perpetrators. This can be artwork by murderers, their possessions, non-evidentiary items related to their crimes. The more famous the killer, the higher the price tag. For example, a painting by John Wayne Gacy, a colorful portrait of his own Pogo the Clown character, sold at auction for nearly $13,000 in 2022. After the release of Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story in 2022, Dahmer's actual aviator glasses went up for auction at $150,000 US. Like Marilyn Monroe's lipstick, the items are only as valuable as the image they conjure, as the ghost of their previous owner. Marketability is an essential part of celebrity culture, and while there are laws passed in the United States that prevent criminals from profiting financially from their crimes, it doesn't mean that other people can't. This feeds into and incentivizes further celebrity worship of murderers.
Of course, Mr. Ramirez. My pleasure to welcome you to the Hotel Cortez. Let me show you your room.
Now, viewers who lived through these historic events might have a more nuanced reading of these true crime retellings. Maybe you watched those explosive trials on TV, or you remember seeing it on the news, so there's a clearer connection to real events. But for younger viewers who are learning about these events for the first time through aestheticized, bingeable, identifiable content, it may have a different effect.
It was very realistic, but props to Evan Peters because he did so well.
In the sea of docuseries and Dexters, we become more distanced from the understanding that these events are real. Real people died. Real families were destroyed.
The pain that you caused my family, that was my baby boy that you took away from me.
Many of those survivors are living and reliving their trauma whenever new content is released.
Every time I think that I'm done with the story, new stories come out.
Beyond that, it's essential to consider that there's a well-documented mental health crisis among today's young people, and treating real murderers as characters with their own misunderstood stories to tell can feed dangerous impressions about power and notoriety. The pressures of social media, an increasingly polarized political landscape, and a bleak outlook for the future have contributed to higher rates of depression and general hopelessness among young people. And although serial killing has declined substantially in the 21st century, mass shootings have increased dramatically, particularly in the 2010s. While news media has been developing best practices for covering such events to avoid giving notoriety to the perpetrators, it's essential that we apply the same critical thinking to the true crime and serial killer media we produce and consume today.
It's our responsibility to make sure that the stories of the other victims are not lost in the shuffle.
It's not just a movie, it's real. Check out this other recent clip from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.